Welcome to our History Now podcast.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, today we are exploring a topic that is just, it's truly monumental. We are talking about the largest internal movement of people in United States history.
The Great Migration.
Exactly, the Great Migration, spanning roughly from 1910 to 1970. We're looking at a period where about 6 million Black Americans relocated from the South to the North, the Midwest, and the West.
Which is just a staggering number when you really sit down and think about it.
Right, and it's a movement that fundamentally reshaped the nation's cultural, economic, and political landscape.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening right now who has roots in Chicago, Detroit, Oakland, or Philadelphia, you know this isn't just some distant history lesson.
Oh, absolutely not.
This is the origin story of our own family reunions. You know, the goal of our conversation today is to really uncover the incredible resilience, the strategy, and the sheer agency behind this multi-generational journey.
I love that we're framing it around agency.
Yeah, we're going to look closely at the historical records and the firsthand experiences documented from that time, just to truly understand how our families built the lives we have today.
And to truly grasp the magnitude of this shift, I mean, the demographic numbers paint such a vivid picture. Back in 1910, almost 90%, that is 9 out of every 10 Black Americans lived in the South.
Mostly in rural areas, right?
Primarily rural agricultural areas, yeah. But then you fast forward to 1970, and nearly half of all African Americans lived outside the South.
Wow.
It's an entire population effectively redistributing itself across the country within a single lifetime. And to understand how that happened, we need to examine the intense push and pull factors that drove millions of our ancestors to uproot their entire lives and step into the complete unknown.
Well, looking at those push factors means looking straight at the grueling reality of Southern life before the migration even began.
Yeah, the daily reality.
Because it wasn't just hard work, it was breaking work. You read the historical accounts of people like Erling Lindsey's father in Alabama. He was a sharecropper, and like so many others, no matter how hard he worked, he could never get out of debt.
Never. The math just wasn't set up for it.
Right. He always owed the landowner something at the end of the year, and the physical toll of the cotton fields was almost unimaginable. We are talking about a growing season that was 7 months long.
Leading right into the worst heat of the year.
Exactly. Culminating in that scorching, suffocating heat of August and September, workers would be dragging cotton sacks that could weigh up to 200 pounds.
200 pounds, just dragging that all day.
Yeah, they'd be crawling down the rows on their hands and knees, wearing these makeshift knee pads, picking cotton from sunup to sundown, just praying for a single cloud to pass over for a momentary patch of shade.
What's fascinating here is how the Jim Crow system functioned as far more than just social segregation. We often just think of the separate facilities, but it was an intricate, legally enforced economic and physical trap.
A complete trap.
The sharecropping system was explicitly designed to keep people bound to the land. Landlords would front supplies, seeds, living expenses at just exorbitant interest rates.
And then take a massive portion of the harvest as repayment.
Exactly. The math never, ever worked in the sharecropper's favor. And the kicker is, legally, you could not leave the land until that debt was paid.
Which was basically impossible.
Right. If you tried to leave, you could be arrested for vagrancy or breach of contract and forced right back into unpaid labor. It was a system carefully constructed to maintain a subservient, captive, and incredibly cheap labor force after the end of slavery.
And the daily indignities engineered into that system were just constant, relentless.
Yeah.
The historical accounts tell us about Black children walking 6 miles to school through thick red mud, while the white children rode past them on a school bus.
Sometimes throwing things out the windows at them.
Throwing things or intentionally chasing them off the road. It was designed to constantly reinforce that racial hierarchy. And there is one particularly heartbreaking story in the records about a father who bought hunting dogs simply to feed his family.
I remember reading about this.
Yeah, some white neighbors decided they wanted to buy those dogs, and when the father refused to sell them because those dogs were literally his family's livelihood, those neighbors returned and poisoned the dogs.
It's just brutal.
It's a stark, brutal reminder of the absolute control white Southerners demanded over every aspect of Black lives, right down to what property you were allowed to keep.
And that control was enforced by the constant looming threat of lethal violence. The danger was incredibly real and pervasive. Between 1880 and 1930, over 450 lynchings were recorded in Georgia alone.
And those are just the recorded ones.
Exactly. That doesn't account for the ones that went entirely undocumented. You also had orchestrated mass mob violence.
Like in
Yes, the horrifying Atlanta race massacre of 1906, where white mobs actively tried to destroy black businesses and just roll back any economic progress that had been made.
And then on top of all that human-made terror, nature kind of stepped in, didn't it?
It did. Add to this volatile, dangerous mix a series of natural disasters. In 1915 and 1916, severe floods swept through the region, and that was followed by a devastating boll weevil infestation that completely decimated the cotton crops across the South.
So the economy just tanked.
The agricultural economy collapsed, and many sharecroppers were cast off the land entirely. The system was basically breaking down under its own weight.
So the pressure was building to a breaking point, and then came the spark. Here's where it gets really interesting. World War I breaks out in Europe, and it effectively cuts off the flow of European immigration to the United States almost overnight.
Overnight, just a hard stop to the labor supply.
Suddenly, northern industries, which had previously completely refused to hire black workers, often claiming they were somehow incapable of industrial work, by the way.
Right, the usual excuses.
Yeah. Suddenly, they were desperate for labor to keep the wartime economy churning. And this is the exact moment Robert S. Abbott enters the picture.
A visionary.
He really was. He was a Georgian native who had moved north and founded a newspaper called the Chicago Defender in 1905.
The Chicago Defender was militant, unapologetic, and incredibly strategic. It had a 9-point platform, and one of those points was the complete destruction of race prejudice in America.
They did not hold back.
Not at all. The paper essentially acted as a beacon, broadcasting the opportunities up north directly to the southern masses. They published job listings, train schedules, success stories.
But just getting that paper into the South was a huge risk.
It was incredibly dangerous. In many southern towns, just being caught holding a copy of the Defender could literally cost you your life. Local authorities considered it seditious material.
So how did they get it down there?
It became this brilliant underground railroad of news. The paper was smuggled across state lines by Pullman porters working the trains, by traveling entertainers, and even by Negro League baseball teams as they barnstormed through the South.
That is so clever.
And if that didn't work, families in the North would take a white metropolitan newspaper, weave the Chicago Defender invisibly inside its pages, and mail it down south to their relatives. It was incredibly effective. Circulation jumped from 33,000 in 1916 to 130,000 just 3 years later.
And the actual readership was way higher than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. With an estimated readership of over 500,000 because copies were passed from hand to hand secretly.
The ingenuity of that communication network is just astounding. But of course, once the movement actually started, the white landowners panicked.
They realized what was happening.
Right. They suddenly realized the very people they had oppressed and undervalued were leaving. They were taking their entire cheap labor force with them. So the local authorities actively tried to sabotage the migration.
Using the law against them.
Always. They passed local ordinances making it illegal for trains to accept prepaid tickets from the north. They banned group travel rates to stop families or church congregations from leaving together.
I mean, they were terrified.
They even sent local police and armed guards right up onto the train platforms to round up black travelers, tear up their tickets, and just intimidate them into staying.
The profound irony, and really the deep-seated racism of that Southern white response, is striking. Because the white establishment falsely believed black people were intellectually inferior, they simply couldn't fathom that African Americans possessed the agency, the organizational skills, or the network to orchestrate this massive movement themselves.
They had to blame someone else.
Exactly. They concocted this elaborate myth that mysterious northern labor agents were sneaking down to stir up the otherwise content workforce.
Latent workforce, right.
When in reality, the true recruiters were the black migrants themselves. They were individuals who had gone north, secured a factory job, made some money, bought nice clothes, and returned home to visit. By simply standing on a corner looking prosperous, they showed everyone in their hometown exactly what was possible.
Which naturally led to some incredibly daring and terrifying escapes. Because of those armed police on the platforms we mentioned, families couldn't just casually board a train in their hometown.
No, it was a covert operation.
They would pack up their entire lives in the dead of night. They would walk miles in the dark along the railroad tracks, carrying whatever they could hold just to catch trains at distant, smaller flag stops where they wouldn't be recognized.
And even when they finally got onto the train, the danger wasn't over.
Not at all. Historical accounts mention travelers being explicitly instructed by conductors to pull down the window shades once the train reached Kentucky or crossed certain state lines.
Because of the mobs.
Right. They had to do this because angry white mobs were known to gather along the tracks and throw rocks and bricks through the windows of the segregated train cars.
Just unbelievable hostility.
And the tickets weren't cheap. They cost around $11, which was a fortune for a sharecropper. And because you couldn't use the dining car, you had to pack your own meals in shoeboxes. Some folks had to endure the multi-day journey sitting on their luggage in the aisles of cars shared with soldiers.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the eventual arrival in the North was a monumental culture shock. For hundreds of thousands of people, the arrival point was the Illinois Central Station at 12th and Michigan in Chicago.
It really was the Black Ellis Island.
That's exactly what it was. Stepping off that train meant a massive shift from a semi-rural agrarian life to a highly industrialized, fast-paced urban one. It quite literally meant trading the rooster for an alarm clock.
A completely different rhythm of life.
Trading walking on dirt roads for navigating a complex, crowded streetcar system. And perhaps most significantly, it meant adjusting from a sun-up to sundown farming schedule governed by the seasons to punching a strict minute-by-minute factory clock.
Which is where organizations like the Urban League stepped in, right?
Yes, they became absolutely crucial. The Urban League stepped in to help migrants adjust to this entirely new reality, helping them find housing, teaching them how to navigate city services, and mediating with northern employers who had never hired black workers before.
And the adjustment was incredibly swift. You read the stories of families who moved strictly for the future of their kids. There's this one well-documented account of a family from rural Arkansas in the late 1920s.
The family of 9, right?
Yeah. The parents noticed their daughter was an exceptional student, so they uprooted the entire family of 9 and moved to Chicago simply so their children could get a proper education, far superior to those underfunded one-room schoolhouses in the South.
That's the pull factor right there.
Yeah.
Hope for the next generation.
Exactly. And when it came to the industrial work, Southern migrants excelled. Factory foremen frequently noted that a worker fresh from a Mississippi farm often turned out more production than guys who had been on the line for years.
Because they knew what hard work really meant.
Right. They knew how to work tirelessly and were just incredibly motivated to keep their new wages.
But of course, the North was by no means a perfect paradise. The racism was different, but it was deeply entrenched. One migrant perfectly captured the difference in a famous quote, noting that in the South, they told you the truth about where the racial lines were.
It was right in your face.
Right. But in Chicago, they wouldn't tell you the truth, but the lines were still strictly enforced.
Yeah.
We saw it on the factory floor, too. The transition to industrial work meant dealing with labor unions. Some unions genuinely offered an outstretched hand of solidarity, recognizing that divided workers were weaker workers.
But not all of them.
No, other unions offered black workers their own separate union local, calling it self-determination, which the workers rightly recognized as just another covert form of Jim Crow.
And that friction over jobs, housing, and political power eventually boiled over into tragedy. I mean, as the black population in Chicago doubled from 50,000 to 100,000 between 1915 and 1919, the tension over physical space became palpable.
The city was basically bursting at the seams.
Bursting. Middle-class black families trying to move to the edges of the overcrowded Black Belt faced immense, violent hostility from white neighborhood associations. At the same time, local newspapers were printing inflammatory headlines framing the influx of black citizens not as a municipal housing crisis, but as a literal threat to public health and safety.
And that simmering tension culminated in the Red Summer of 1919.
Such a dark chapter.
The tragic catalyst occurred when a young black teenager named Eugene Williams fell asleep on his raft in Lake Michigan. He drifted across an invisible segregated line in the water, getting too close to a white beach.
Over an invisible line in the water.
White beachgoers threw stones at him until he drowned. The police refused to arrest the white man responsible, and the ensuing riots across the city lasted for over a week. The violence left 38 people dead, 23 black and 15 white, along with over 500 injured and 1,000 black families left homeless after their residences were torched.
Torching their homes.
It was a stark, horrifying reality check that the Promised Land had its own deep-seated systemic perils.
It is a sobering reminder of the price that was paid for that migration, but moving forward on the timeline, we hit a massive turning point that fundamentally shifts the entire nature of the movement and kicks off the second wave.
The technological shift.
Exactly. On October 2, 1944, at the Hobson Plantation in Clarksdale, Mississippi, everything changed. That was the day the mechanical cotton picker was officially unveiled to the public.
A game changer.
It was a machine that had been in development for years, but once perfected, it was devastating to the manual labor force. To put this in perspective, picking a bale of cotton by hand cost a plantation owner about $42. With this new machine, the cost plummeted to just $5 a bale.
This raises an important question about the nature of the migration itself, because it changed who was leaving and, more importantly, why they were leaving.
The motivation completely flipped.
Right. During the first waves, the people boarding the trains were primarily migrants. They were individuals actively seeking out better educational and industrial opportunities. They were making a choice to pursue upward mobility.
They were pulled towards something.
Exactly. But the widespread adoption of the mechanical cotton picker turned the second wave into what many historians accurately describe as refugees.
Refugees in their own country.
Yes, they were being forced off the land because their labor was simply no longer needed. The machine completely replaced them, leaving them with no economic foundation and no way to survive in the rural South.
Wait, that completely changes how we look at the 1950s and 60s. The first wave was chasing a dream, but the second wave was literally running from obsolescence.
It was about sheer survival at that point.
You see this vividly in the historical accounts of people who watched the machines arrive. There's a story of a woman from Clarksdale who watched her neighbors leaving in the late 30s, but it wasn't until the machines arrived in the mid-40s and cut out all the jobs that she finally made the move to Chicago.
She had to be pushed.
Yeah. And when she arrived in the post-war boom, the jobs were incredibly plentiful. The record notes she got hired at 3 different jobs in a single day.
3 in one day.
Yeah, if she didn't like running the presses at a laundry, she'd just walk down the street and get hired at a factory. At the same time, World War II was opening up an entirely new geographic frontier.
Heading west.
Thanks in part to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802, which officially banned discriminatory employment practices by federal agencies and companies engaged in war-related work, a whole new world of defense jobs opened up.
That wartime boom pushed the migration map much further west. You had massive numbers of African Americans heading to California, specifically Los Angeles and Oakland, as well as to Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington.
Working in the shipyards and factories.
Right, to build ships, assemble airplanes, and manufacture munitions. But whether they went north to Chicago or west to Oakland, they ran into a sophisticated, systemic housing trap.
Or restrictive covenants.
Localities and banks implemented restrictive covenants and redlining policies. A restrictive covenant was a legally enforceable clause written right into a property deed that explicitly prohibited the sale or rental of that home to anyone who wasn't white.
It was literally written into the deed.
And redlining wasn't just a metaphor. Banks and federal housing agencies literally drew red lines on city maps around black neighborhoods, categorizing them as hazardous. They refused to issue mortgages or loans within those red lines.
So you couldn't get a loan, you couldn't build equity.
These deliberate strategies trapped black populations in overcrowded, segregated neighborhoods, entirely cutting them off from the wealth-building opportunities of homeownership that built the white middle class. And it forced many into massive public housing complexes.
A prime example of how that housing strategy played out is the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. When they opened in October of 1962, they were pitched as a beacon of hope, designed to relieve the intense, dangerous overcrowding of the black community.
People were excited to move in at first.
They were. Early residents remember feeling incredibly safe. One woman recalled working late shifts and feeling perfectly secure walking time through the complex at 4 a.m.
Wow. Quite a contrast to what it became.
Right, because over the next decade, things changed drastically. By the late 1970s, due to intentional systemic neglect, a severe lack of municipal resources, and the concentration of deep poverty, the complex became a tragic symbol of the failures of the federal government's housing policies.
Just abandoned by the city.
Overrun with infrastructure failures and crime, eventually leading many families to leave the very cities they had fought so hard to reach.
Looking back at those 6 decades of continuous movement, the broader legacy is just staggering. The Great Migration effectively reinvented Black America. It transformed a predominantly rural agricultural culture into an intensely urban, cosmopolitan one.
It sparked a cultural revolution.
The concentration of black populations in major cities literally birthed the Harlem Renaissance in New York, fostering a massive explosion of literature, art, and intellectualism. It gave us modern electric blues and jazz as musicians moved up from the Delta to Chicago and Detroit.
The sound of modern America.
Furthermore, it created entirely new political power centers. Chicago's South Side, for example, grew so densely populated and influential it was deemed the capital of Black America, building its own banks, insurance corporations, and eventually taking the political reins of the city itself.
Okay, let's unpack this because history never actually stops moving.
No, it doesn't.
By the 1990s, the industrial core of the North and Midwest, what became known as the Rust Belt, began to heavily decline. The factory jobs that had drawn the first and second waves disappeared overseas or were automated.
The economic engine stalled.
Meanwhile, the Sun Belt economy in the South was experiencing a massive surge. Attracted by more affordable housing, growing corporate job opportunities, and the fact that the legal framework of Jim Crow had finally been dismantled by the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans began a significant reverse migration back to the South.
But the destination for this reverse migration wasn't the rural agricultural farms their grandparents had fled.
They weren't going back to sharecropping.
Not at all. They were moving to the booming southern metropolitan areas. Take Metro Atlanta, for example. Between 1990 and 2020, its black population more than doubled, topping 2 million people.
2 million?
It became an incredible hub of black affluence, higher education, and political change, earning nicknames like the Black Mecca and Black Hollywood. It is a remarkable, full-circle historical moment where the descendants of those who fled the South returned to shape its modern political and cultural landscape.
It really is a powerful full-circle moment. Though, looking at the data, it's a highly complex reality.
Very complex.
While cities like Atlanta have a thriving, visible black middle and upper class, they still grapple with serious, deeply rooted issues in poor neighborhoods. Things like severe income inequality, systemic poverty, and ongoing issues with policing and gentrification that continue to affect those communities today. The search for the perfect promised land is clearly an ongoing, evolving journey.
And that reality leaves us to reflect on the immense scale of what happened between 1910 and 1970. We are talking about 6 million people who made a conscious, terrifying choice to step into the complete unknown.
Leaving everything they knew behind.
They faced incredible hostility, physical violence, and sophisticated systemic barriers, yet they persevered. They built resilient communities, they established cultural institutions, they educated their children, and they permanently changed the demographic and cultural fabric of American society.
So what does this all mean for us today? The one thing that stands out profoundly to me is the immense courage of those 6 million ancestors. They didn't just move themselves in their suitcases, they physically shifted the political, economic, and cultural axis of the entire United States.
They forced the country to change.
Their choices, their sacrifices, and their sheer determination built the very foundation of the cities and neighborhoods we live in right now.
That enduring legacy leaves us with a final thought to ponder. If the first two waves of the migration were driven by the urgent search for basic physical safety and industrial opportunity, and the reverse migration was driven by a desire to reclaim the South and build generational wealth, what will be the catalyst and the destination for the next great movement of Black Americans in the 21st century? Will it be driven by climate change, the search for digital equity, or something we haven't even anticipated yet?
That is a brilliant and powerful question to leave you with. Thank you so much for joining us in this exploration of our history. We hope you keep questioning the narratives, keep learning about the forces that shaped our communities, and keep honoring the incredible stories of those who paved the way. Until next time.